The first time Florence Leland saved a man's life, she did it without ever hearing a single word he spoke. The town of Prairie Hollow sat in the shadow of the Laramie Mountains, a scattering of clapboard buildings and dust-choked streets in the Wyoming Territory of 1878, the kind of place where the wind carried the smell of sagebrush and coal smoke in equal measure. Florence had been born deaf, silent since her first breath, and she had spent all 22 years of her life learning to read the world through her eyes instead of her ears. She watched mouths the way other women watched skies for storms, and she had grown so skilled at it that most folks in town forgot, after a while, that she could not hear the bell over the mercantile door or the church choir on Sunday mornings. Her father, Ezra Leland, ran the blacksmith shop at the edge of town, a low stone building with a forge that never seemed to cool, and Florence had grown up amid the ringing of hammers on iron, a sound she had never once heard but had felt in her chest 1,000 times, the vibration traveling up through the packed dirt floor and into her bones. She worked the bellows for him, fed the coals, held the horses steady while he fitted their shoes, and in the long hours between customers she read his lips as he told her stories about her mother, who had died birthing her, and about the wild years before the town had a name. It was a hot afternoon in late June when Phineas Ellsworth first rode up to the smithy with a limping bay gelding and a look of quiet worry creasing his sun-browned face. Florence saw him before he saw her. She was mucking out the stall at the side of the shop when the shadow of a tall rider fell across the doorway, and she straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron, and watched as he dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent more of his life in a saddle than out of one. He was perhaps 30 years old, broad through the shoulders, with sandy hair curling out from beneath a battered hat, and eyes the color of creek water in springtime. He led the gelding toward the forge, and when Ezra came out wiping soot from his hands, Florence watched the stranger's mouth move. "Afternoon," he said, though she could not hear the word, only see the shape of it forming on his lips. "This animal's thrown a shoe somewhere on the Cheyenne road, and I would be obliged if you could see to him before nightfall." Ezra nodded and gestured for the man to bring the horse closer, and it was then that Phineas noticed Florence standing near the stall, her dark hair escaping its braid in damp curls around her face, her eyes fixed intently on his mouth in a way that most men found unsettling, but that he found, for reasons he could not immediately name, rather remarkable. "This is my daughter," Ezra said, turning so that Florence could see his lips as well. "Florence, she cannot hear you, mister, but she reads faces better than any person I ever met. You will get used to her watching you talk." Phineas removed his hat, an old habit his mother had beaten into him as a boy, and inclined his head toward Florence in a small bow that made her cheeks warm despite the heat of the forge. "Phineas Ellsworth," he said slowly, exaggerating his words just slightly, as though he understood instinctively what she needed from him. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Leland." Florence smiled and signed a small greeting with her hands, one that Ezra had taught her long ago, and though Phineas did not understand the gesture, he smiled back as if he did, and something in that exchange settled warm and strange in Florence's chest, a feeling she had no name for yet. Phineas Ellsworth owned the Circle E Ranch, 11,000 acres of grassland and creek bottom that his father had homesteaded 20 years before, back when the territory was still crawling with Sioux hunting parties, and the nearest law was 3 days' ride to the south. He ran nearly 2,000 head of cattle on that land, and every autumn he drove a portion of the herd north to the railhead at Cheyenne to sell to the beef buyers who shipped Wyoming steers back east to feed the cities. It was hard, unglamorous work, full of dust and heat and long nights under a sky so full of stars it seemed to press down on a man's shoulders, but Phineas loved it the way some men loved whiskey or cards, with a devotion that bordered on foolishness. He had never married. There had been a girl once, back in Ohio before his family came west, but that had ended the way young love often did, with distance and time wearing it thin until it broke apart entirely. Since then he had poured himself into the ranch, into the endless work of fences and branding and cattle drives, and he had told himself, in the quiet moments before sleep, that he did not mind being alone. But there was something about the blacksmith's daughter that lodged itself in his mind that afternoon and would not be shaken loose. He returned to the smithy 3 days later, though his gelding's shoe had been perfectly sound since Ezra fixed it, using the excuse of needing a new latch forged for his barn door. Ezra, no fool, glanced between the young rancher and his daughter with a knowing look but said nothing, only took the measurements Phineas gave him and set to work at the forge, while Florence swept the floor nearby, stealing glances at the tall rancher who kept finding reasons to linger. "Your daughter," Phineas said to Ezra while the old blacksmith hammered at a strip of glowing iron. "How did she learn to speak so well with her hands, and to read mouths the way she does?" Ezra did not look up from his work, but he answered readily enough, accustomed to the question. "Her mother's sister was deaf too, back in Missouri, before we came west." Florence learned some signs from letters her aunt sent, drawings mostly, and the rest she taught herself, watching folks talk her whole life. "She is smarter than any man I ever shod a horse for, mister, and do not let her quiet fool you into thinking otherwise." "I would not dream of it," Phineas said, and when he turned to look at Florence, he found her already watching him, her dark eyes steady and searching, and he felt his pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with the heat of the forge. Florence, for her part, had begun to notice that she watched for the sound of hooves on the road more often than she used to, though of course she could not hear them, only feel the faint tremor through the ground beneath her feet or catch the movement from the corner of her eye. She found herself dressing more carefully on the days she guessed he might visit, tucking wildflowers into her braid, and she scolded herself for it even as she did it again the next morning. It was her father who finally spoke plainly to her one evening, signing slowly so she would catch every word, his weathered hands shaping the words with the patience of a man who had learned an entirely new language out of love for his daughter. "That rancher comes around here more than any latch or horseshoe requires," Ezra signed, a small smile tugging at his mustache. "You have caught his eye, Florence, same as he has caught yours. I see no shame in it. He is an honest man, hardworking, and he treats you like you are made of something precious instead of something broken. That is more than most men in this territory would manage." Florence had signed back, her cheeks flushing, that she did not know what to do with such feelings, that no man before had ever looked at her the way Phineas Ellsworth did, without pity or impatience, but simply with open curiosity and warmth. Ezra had only laughed and told her that falling in love was not something a person did anything with, only something that happened to them, the way weather happened to the plains. The trouble came, as trouble in the Wyoming Territory so often did, over water and land. Silas Corbett owned the Diamond Sea spread that bordered the Circle E to the west, an operation nearly twice the size of Phineas's ranch. Built on land Corbett had acquired through methods that were, at best, ethically questionable and at worst, outright theft from homesteaders too poor or too frightened to fight back. Corbett was a heavy-set man with a gambler's smile and cold gray eyes, and he had wanted the water rights to Willow Creek, which ran through the heart of Phineas's property, for nearly 3 years. Willow Creek was the lifeblood of that stretch of prairie, the only reliable water source for 20 miles in any direction during the dry months of summer, and whoever controlled it controlled the ability to run cattle on thousands of acres beyond their own fence lines. Corbett had offered to buy the Circle E outright the previous spring, a price so low it amounted to an insult, and when Phineas refused, Corbett's smile had not faltered, though something colder had settled behind his eyes. "You will regret this decision, Ellsworth," Corbett had said that day, standing in the dust of the Circle E's front yard with 2 of his hired men flanking him like wolves at a fence line. "A man alone out here, without family, without friends in the right places, that man can find himself in a great deal of trouble." Phineas had not backed down, had told Corbett plainly that Willow Creek belonged to the Circle E and would stay that way as long as he drew breath, and Corbett had ridden off without another word, but Phineas had felt the threat settle over his ranch like a shadow that would not lift. He had not told Florence about any of this, not directly, though she had noticed the tension in his jaw during his visits to the smithy, the way his eyes sometimes drifted to the window as though watching for riders on the road. She had asked her father about it once, signing her question while Ezra worked, and Ezra had told her only that there was trouble brewing between the Circle E and the Diamond C, the kind of trouble that had gotten men killed in other parts of the territory, and that she should keep her eyes open when Corbett's men came through town. Corbett's men came through town often enough, rowdy and loud in the saloon, and they came to the smithy too from time to have their horses shod or their gear repaired, and Florence, invisible to them in the way that quiet people so often were, watched their mouths move as they talked among themselves, gathering fragments of conversation the way a person might gather fallen leaves without any particular purpose, simply because they were there to be gathered. It was on a Tuesday in late September, with the cottonwoods along the creek beginning to turn gold and the nights carrying the first sharp bite of coming autumn, that 3 of Corbett's riders brought their horses to Ezra's smithy for shoeing, and Florence, holding a chestnut mare steady while her father worked, watched their conversation unfold in the dusty light of the open doorway. "Corbett says we hit them at Deadman's Pass," said the first man, a lean rider with a scar through his eyebrow that Florence had seen in town before, though she did not know his name. "Ellsworth drives his herd through there Thursday morning, same as every year, on account of it being the only decent crossing before the railhead road. Ain't no other way through them rocks." The second man, heavier, with a beard the color of rust, nodded and spat into the dirt before answering, and Florence caught his words with the same careful attention she gave to every conversation, a skill so ingrained in her that she scarcely noticed herself doing it anymore. "Corbett wants it done quiet. No witnesses, no marshal sniffing around after. We take Ellsworth out at the pass, scatter his herd into the canyon where our boys can gather them up easy, and by the time anybody comes looking, there won't be nothing left to find but tracks that could belong to anybody." Florence's hands had gone still on the mare's bridle, her heart suddenly hammering so hard she feared the animal would feel it and startle. She kept her eyes fixed on the men's mouths, terrified that if she looked away even for a moment she might miss some crucial detail, some piece of the puzzle that could mean the difference between Phineas riding home safe or not riding home at all. "Thursday morning," the third man confirmed, checking something in his saddlebag, "before first light, so we got the advantage of the dark and the narrow ground. 6 of us ought to be plenty against 1 man and a couple of drovers." They finished their business with Ezra shortly after, paying for the shoeing and riding off toward the Diamond Sea without so much as a glance at the blacksmith's daughter who had stood not 10 feet away, absorbing every word of their murder plot as easily as if they had shouted it from the rooftops. Florence's mind raced as she watched them disappear down the road in a cloud of dust. Thursday morning, Deadman's Pass, before first light. 6 men against Phineas and whatever drovers he had hired for the drive. She turned to find her father watching her, and something in her face must have told him plainly that something was wrong, because he set down his hammer immediately and crossed the shop to her side. "Florence, what is it? You look as though you have seen a ghost." Her hands shook as she signed the words, forcing herself to slow down so he could understand her, though every part of her wanted to run, to move, to do something immediately rather than stand here explaining. "Those men, Corbett's men, they are going to ambush Phineas Thursday morning at Deadman's Pass before dawn when he drives his herd through. 6 of them against him and his drovers. They mean to kill him and take his cattle and make it look like nobody's doing." Ezra's face went pale beneath the soot and sweat, and for a moment he simply stared at his daughter as though the words needed time to settle into something he could believe. Then his jaw tightened, and Florence saw in him the same fierce protectiveness that had raised her alone after her mother's death, the same stubborn love that had taught himself an entire language of hands, just so his daughter would never be alone in a room full of talking mouths. "You are certain of this," he signed, though it was not really a question. "You read it correctly." "I am certain," Florence signed back, her hands steady now with purpose instead of fear. "I watched their mouths the whole time. There is no mistake, Papa. Phineas is in terrible danger, and today is already Tuesday. We have only tomorrow to warn him, and then it will be too late." It was decided, after a hurried conversation in which Ezra insisted on riding out himself and Florence insisted with equal stubbornness that she would go too, that the two of them would ride to the Circle E ranch that very evening rather than wait for morning, because there was no telling what might happen if they delayed even a single day. Ezra saddled the two horses they kept behind the smithy, an old mare named Bessie, and a rangier gelding he sometimes rode into the mountains for iron ore, and within the hour they were riding hard across the darkening prairie toward the Circle E, 10 miles distant by the wagon road, but closer if they cut across the open grassland the way Ezra knew from years of hauling supplies between the ranches. The Circle E ranch house came into view just as the last light was fading from the western sky. A sturdy log building with lamplight glowing in its windows, smoke rising from the chimney into the cooling autumn air. Phineas himself was in the corral when they arrived, checking the legs of a young mare he intended to use as a cutting horse come spring, and he looked up in surprise at the sound of approaching hooves, his hand instinctively drifting toward the rifle leaning against the corral fence before he recognized the riders. "Ezra Leland," he called out, relief plain in his voice as he came to meet them at the gate, "and Miss Leland too. This is unexpected. Is something wrong? You have ridden hard, I can see it in your horses." Florence slid down from Bessie's back before her father could even begin explaining, her hands already moving urgently, though she knew Phineas could not understand sign language and would need her father to translate. But she found herself signing anyway, unable to stop the words from pouring out of her fingers even as she searched his face for some sign that he understood the urgency if nothing else. Ezra swung down from his horse and stepped between them, his own breath still ragged from the hard ride. "Mr. Ellsworth, my daughter has terrible news, and I beg you to listen close, because there is not much time. This morning 3 of Corbett's riders brought their horses to my shop, and Florence read their talk while they waited. They mean to ambush you Thursday morning at Deadman's Pass, before first light, when you drive your herd through. 6 men, Corbett's orders, meant to kill you and scatter your cattle so it looks like nobody's doing." Phineas stood very still for a long moment, the color draining from his weathered face as the weight of the words settled over him. He looked past Ezra to Florence, who stood watching him with an intensity that seemed to reach straight into his chest, and something passed between them in that look, something that went beyond gratitude, though gratitude was certainly part of it. "You are certain," Phineas said finally, echoing the same question Ezra had asked hours before. "Your daughter read this correctly, watching their mouths from across the shop." "I have known my daughter her whole life," Ezra said, his voice firm with the conviction of a father who had learned long ago never to doubt his child's abilities simply because the world around them so often did. "She has never once been wrong about a thing she read from a man's mouth, not since she was old enough to understand what talking meant. If Florence says Corbett means to kill you Thursday at Deadman's Pass, then that is exactly what Corbett means to do, and you would do well to listen." Phineas turned back to Florence then, and though he could not sign, he spoke slowly and clearly, watching her eyes to make certain she was reading his lips. "Thank you," he said, and even without hearing the words, Florence could see the depth of feeling behind them, could see in the set of his mouth and the brightness of his eyes something that went far beyond simple gratitude for a warning. "You have saved my life, Miss Leland, and I do not know how I will ever repay such a debt." Florence shook her head and signed something, and Ezra translated for her, though his own eyes had grown suspiciously bright. "She says there is no debt. She says any decent person would have done the same, and that the only thing that matters now is making certain you live to see Friday morning." Phineas allowed himself a small, tired laugh at that, though there was little humor in it, only the beginning of a fierce and desperate resolve. "Well then," he said, "I suppose we had better make a plan, because I do not intend to let Silas Corbett take my ranch or my life without a considerable fight." They sat around the kitchen table in the ranch house long into the night, Phineas and Ezra talking through the details, while Florence watched every word pass between them, occasionally interjecting a thought through her father's translation, a sharpness to her observations that made both men pause more than once to consider her suggestions seriously. Phineas's foreman, a grizzled old cowhand named Walter Briggs, who had worked the Circle E since Phineas's father first staked the claim, was summoned from the bunkhouse and brought into the conversation, his weathered face growing grimmer with every detail. "Deadman's Pass," Walter said, scratching at his gray stubble. "There ain't but the one way through them rocks, that is true enough. Narrow canyon, walls close on both sides, perfect spot for an ambush if a man wanted to spring one. But that narrowness cuts both ways, Mr. Ellsworth. If we know they are waiting, we can turn that canyon into a trap for them instead." Phineas leaned forward over the table, his exhaustion from the day's work forgotten in the face of this new urgency. "Go on, Walter." "What are you thinking?" "We change the route," Walter said. "Take the herd around by the old Sutter Trail instead, longer by half a day, but it avoids the pass entirely. Meanwhile, we send word to Marshal Coates in Cheyenne. Let the law know what Corbett is planning. If we can catch his men waiting in ambush with nobody to ambush, and a marshal there to witness it, that is evidence enough to hang the lot of them for attempted murder, or at the very least run Corbett clean out of the territory." It was a good plan, solid and sensible, and Phineas found himself nodding along with it even as his gaze kept drifting toward Florence, who sat quietly beside her father, her sharp eyes moving between the men's faces as they talked, missing nothing despite the rapid pace of the conversation. He thought, not for the first time that evening, that he had never met a woman quite like her, someone whose silence held more understanding than most people managed with a lifetime of hearing and speaking. It was decided that Ezra would ride to Cheyenne himself at first light to fetch the marshal, given that he knew the road and could make good time, while Phineas and his men prepared to move the herd along the alternate route come Thursday, well before Corbett's ambush party would even realize their prey had never come near Deadman's Pass at all. Florence, despite her father's protests, insisted on staying at the Circle E to help however she could, arguing through signs that Phineas needed someone who could watch for Corbett's men approaching the ranch itself, someone whose silence made her invisible in a way that a hearing person simply could not manage, since she would notice movement and lip-read intentions long before anyone heard hoofbeats on the wind. "She has a point," Phineas admitted reluctantly, watching Ezra's face twist with fatherly worry. "If Corbett sends scouts to watch the ranch, to see if we suspect anything, Florence would catch it faster than any of my hands. But I promise you, Ezra, I will keep her safe as if she were my own family. Nothing will happen to your daughter while she is under my roof." Ezra studied the younger man for a long moment, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond the immediate crisis, a recognition of the way Phineas looked at Florence when he thought no one was watching closely enough to notice. Finally, the old blacksmith nodded, though his jaw remained tight with worry. "See that you do, Mr. Ellsworth. That girl is the only family I have left in this world, and I would burn this whole territory down before I let harm come to her." Florence spent that night in the small guest room at the back of the ranch house, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, her mind turning over the events of the day again and again. She thought of Corbett's men, their careless mouths spilling out murder plans as though she were nothing more than furniture in the room, and she felt a fierce satisfaction at the thought of their plan crumbling to nothing when they found only empty rocks waiting for them at Deadman's Pass. But mostly she thought of Phineas, of the way he had looked at her across the kitchen table, of the warmth in his eyes that had nothing to do with gratitude for a warning and everything to do with something else entirely, something that made her chest ache with a hope she had never quite allowed herself before. She had always assumed, in the quiet corners of her heart where she kept her most private fears, that no man would ever look past her deafness to see the woman underneath it, that she would spend her life as her father's helper at the forge and nothing more, growing old in the same small rooms where she had grown up. But Phineas Ellsworth had never once treated her differently for her silence. He spoke to her directly, watched her face when he talked, waited patiently while her father translated her responses, and something in his patience felt less like accommodation and more like genuine interest, genuine care. Wednesday passed in a blur of preparation. Ezra rode for Cheyenne before dawn, promising to return with Marshal Coates by Thursday evening at the latest, and Phineas spent the day rerouting his drovers and quietly informing his most trusted hands of the danger, sworn to secrecy, lest word somehow reach Corbett's ears before the trap could be properly sprung. Florence, true to her word, positioned herself near the ranch house windows through much of the afternoon, watching the horizon for any sign of riders, and it was in the golden light of late afternoon, with the sun beginning its slow descent toward the mountains, that Phineas found a quiet moment to sit with her on the porch steps, away from the bustle of preparation happening around them. He had brought a slate and a piece of chalk from the house, an idea that had occurred to him some time during the sleepless hours of the previous night, and he offered it to her now with a hopeful, almost boyish expression that made her smile despite the tension of the day. "I thought," he said slowly, watching her lips to make certain she understood, "that perhaps we might talk more easily this way. I know your father taught you some signs, and I would like to learn them properly in time, but for now, perhaps we could write." Florence took the slate from him, her fingers brushing his for just a moment longer than necessary, and wrote in a careful, looping hand, "I would like that very much." They spent the better part of an hour there on the porch steps, passing the slate back and forth as the sun sank lower, and the sky turned amber and rose above the mountains. And Florence learned that Phineas had come west with his family as a boy of 10, that his mother had died of fever 3 winters after they settled the ranch, that his father had passed only 2 years ago, leaving him alone to run the Circle E with nothing but Walter Briggs and a handful of loyal hands to help him. She learned that he loved the smell of rain on dry grass, that he had once wanted to be a school teacher before deciding that ranching suited his restless nature better, that he had never told anyone about the schoolteacher dream until this very moment, writing it out on a chalk slate for a deaf blacksmith's daughter he had known scarcely 3 months. In turn, she wrote about her mother, whom she had never known but had heard about endlessly from her father, about the aunt in Missouri who had first taught her signs through letters and drawings sent across the miles, about the loneliness of growing up different in a town that did not always know what to make of a girl who could not hear their words but somehow always seemed to understand them anyway. She wrote about the fear she carried, quiet and constant, that she would never find a man who could see past her silence to whatever else she might be. And when Phineas read those words on the slate, his expression grew so soft and so earnest that Florence felt her breath catch in her throat. "I see you," he said, speaking the words slowly so she could read them on his lips even as he reached for the chalk to write them as well, as though he wanted to make absolutely certain she understood him. "I have seen you since the very first day I brought that lame gelding to your father's shop, Florence. Your silence is not something I look past. It is part of what makes you who you are, and who you are is remarkable." She could not find words to write back. Her eyes suddenly blurred with tears she had not expected, and instead she simply reached out and took his hand, holding it between both of hers, and they sat together on the porch steps as the last light faded from the sky, saying nothing at all and somehow saying everything that mattered. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear. the kind of crisp autumn dawn that Wyoming produced with such regularity that longtime residents scarcely noticed its beauty anymore. Phineas rode out with his drovers well before first light, following the alternate Sutter Trail exactly as Walter had suggested, the herd moving slow and steady across ground that had never seen an ambush prepared for it. Florence remained at the ranch house, her nerves stretched thin with worry despite her confidence in the plan, watching the eastern horizon for any sign of her father's return with the marshal. Meanwhile, at Deadman's Pass, 6 of Corbett's men huddled in the pre-dawn darkness among the rocks, rifles ready, waiting for a herd that would never come. As the sun rose higher and no cattle appeared on the trail, their confusion turned first to suspicion, and then, as a lone rider approached from the direction of Cheyenne, to outright panic. Ezra had indeed reached Marshal Coates the previous evening, and the marshal, a broad-shouldered man with 20 years of frontier law behind him, had ridden through the night with 2 deputies to reach the pass before dawn, positioning themselves in the rocks above the ambush party with the patient thoroughness of men who understood exactly how much evidence they needed to make an arrest that would hold up in a territorial court. The ambush party's confusion gave the marshal all the time he needed. When he finally revealed himself, rifle leveled and voice carrying clear across the narrow canyon, Corbett's men found themselves surrounded and outmaneuvered, their rifles still loaded with the intent to murder a man who had simply never arrived. 2 of them surrendered without resistance, recognizing a lost cause when they saw one, while the other 4 attempted to flee back toward the Diamond Sea, only to be caught within the hour by deputies stationed along the return route, exactly as Marshal Coates had anticipated. Under questioning back in Cheyenne, faced with charges of attempted murder and conspiracy that carried the very real possibility of hanging, the ambush party's leader, the scarred man Florence had first observed at her father's shop, proved eager enough to name Silas Corbett as the architect of the entire scheme in exchange for a reduced sentence. It was evidence enough, combined with the physical presence of armed men waiting in ambush at Deadman's Pass, to secure a warrant for Corbett's arrest on charges that would end his ranching ambitions in Wyoming Territory permanently. Word reached the Circle E by messenger late Thursday afternoon, and Florence, watching from the porch, saw the rider approaching from a distance and felt her heart leap into her throat with fear before she recognized the shape of her father's own horse beneath the rider, Ezra himself bringing the news personally rather than trusting it to a stranger. She ran to meet him at the gate, and when he swung down from his horse with a broad, exhausted smile on his face, she did not need words, signed or spoken, to understand that everything had gone according to plan. "They caught them," Ezra signed, his hands shaking slightly with the emotion of the day, every last one of them right there at the pass, waiting for a herd that never came. Corbett himself was arrested not 2 hours ago, taken into custody at his own ranch house without a shot fired. Marshal Coates says it is the cleanest case he has ever built, thanks entirely to you, my girl. Thanks to your eyes and your sharp mind that reads what other folks cannot even hear. Florence embraced her father fiercely, her relief so overwhelming that she scarcely noticed the sound of approaching hooves until Phineas himself rode into the yard, having heard the news from one of his own drovers who had crossed paths with the marshal's messenger along the trail. He dismounted quickly, his eyes searching for Florence, and when he found her standing there in the golden afternoon light, safe and whole and smiling through tears of relief, he crossed the distance between them without a word and pulled her into his arms. Florence had never been held that way before, not by any man, and she felt the warmth of it spread through her entire body, felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek where her head rested on his chest. And she thought, in that quiet golden moment, that she had never in her whole life felt so completely safe and so completely seen. "You saved my life," Phineas murmured into her hair, and though she could not hear the words, She felt the vibration of them rumbling through his chest. And somehow that felt like enough, felt like more than enough, felt like the beginning of everything she had never quite dared to hope for. Ezra, watching the two of them from a respectful distance, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile and said nothing at all, understanding that some moments needed no witness beyond the two people living inside them. The weeks that followed brought a strange, welcome quiet to the Circle E and to Prairie Hollow as a whole. With Corbett awaiting trial in the territorial capital and his hired men either jailed or scattered to other territories rather than risk facing charges themselves, the Diamond Sea Ranch fell into disarray, its remaining hands drifting away one by one in search of steadier employment, until the sprawling property that Corbett had built through greed and intimidation stood largely empty, its future uncertain, but its threat to the Circle E entirely extinguished. Phineas found himself riding to the smithy in town nearly every day that autumn, his excuses growing thinner and more transparent each time, until even Ezra began to tease him gently about it while Florence blushed and pretended not to notice, though of course she noticed everything, watching his mouth form words of greeting from across the yard before he had even fully dismounted. Their courtship, if it could be called something so formal, unfolded slowly and sweetly across those autumn weeks, built on chalk slates and careful, deliberate speech, on Phineas's determined efforts to learn the signs Florence's aunt had taught her so many years before. He proved a clumsy student at first, his large hands fumbling through gestures that Florence executed with effortless grace, but he persisted with the same stubborn determination he brought to every challenge on the ranch, practicing in the evenings by lamplight until his fingers ached, simply so he might one day speak to her in her own language rather than always requiring her to meet him in his. "You do not have to learn all of it," Florence wrote to him one evening on the slate, watching his frustrated concentration as he struggled to remember the sign for tomorrow. "I can read your lips well enough. You need not trouble yourself so." Phineas took the chalk from her hands and wrote his answer with a firmness that left no room for argument. "I want to trouble myself. I want to speak to you the way you speak, not just watch your mouth read my words back to me. You have spent your whole life learning to understand a world that mostly never bothered learning to understand you back. I intend to be different, Florence. I intend to meet you halfway, or further than halfway if I must." She had cried at that quietly, and he had gathered her into his arms on the porch steps where they so often sat together now, and neither of them had needed words at all in that particular moment, only the closeness of two people who had found, against all expectation, exactly what they had not known they were searching for. He asked her father's permission to court her formally on a chilly evening in October, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the smithy with his hat clutched in both hands like a nervous schoolboy, rather than the successful rancher he had become. Ezra, who had watched this romance unfold with a father's mixture of pride and protective worry for months already, did not make him wait long for an answer. "You already have my blessing, Mr. Ellsworth," Ezra said, a warm smile creasing his weathered face. "You have had it since the night you promised to keep my daughter safe, and then proved yourself a man of your word. I only ask that you continue treating her as the remarkable woman she is, and that you never once let her silence become an excuse for anything less than the fullest partnership a marriage can offer." "I promise you that, sir, with my whole heart," Phineas said, and he meant every word of it. He proposed to Florence 3 weeks later, on a crisp November afternoon beneath the same cottonwood trees along Willow Creek that had so nearly become the site of his murder, the water running clear and cold over smooth stones, while golden leaves drifted down around them on a gentle breeze. He had practiced the signs for weeks in secret, working with a patience that surprised even Walter Briggs, who had caught his employer muttering to himself, and moving his hands strangely in the bunkhouse on more than one occasion, and had wisely chosen not to ask questions. When Florence arrived at the creek that afternoon, Summoned by a note her father had delivered with an unusually knowing smile, she found Phineas waiting for her beneath the largest cottonwood, and before she could ask what this was about, he began to sign, slowly and carefully, every word deliberate and clear despite his obvious nervousness. "Florence Leland," he signed, his hands shaking only slightly, "you have given me my life twice over. Once when you warned me of the ambush that would have killed me, and again every single day since, simply by being who you are. I do not want to spend my life writing you notes on a slate and hoping you might read my lips correctly from across a room. I want to spend my life beside you, learning your language properly, building a home where your silence is never a burden but always simply a part of the woman I love beyond all reason. Will you marry me?" Florence stood very still beneath the cottonwood tree, tears streaming freely down her face, and then she was laughing and crying at once, throwing her arms around his neck with such force that he nearly stumbled backward into the creek. And though her answer came in signs he had only recently learned to read, there was no mistaking the enthusiastic, tearful yes that she gave him, over and over, as though the word alone could not possibly convey everything she felt. They were married in December, in the small church at Prairie Hollow, with the whole town turning out to witness the union of the blacksmith's remarkable daughter and the rancher whose life she had saved. Ezra walked her down the aisle with tears he made no effort to hide, and Walter Briggs stood as Phineas's best man, gruffly wiping at his own eyes when the young minister pronounced them husband and wife. The Reverend had learned enough basic signs in the weeks leading up to the ceremony to include Florence properly in the vows, an accommodation that moved half the congregation to tears before the ceremony had even concluded. And when Phineas kissed his bride before the assembled town, Florence felt, for the first time in her entire life, that she belonged completely and entirely to a place and a person. That her silence had never once been a barrier to love, but had instead led her directly toward the deepest love she had ever known. Silas Corbett's trial concluded that same winter, and he was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, his ranch seized and sold at auction to pay the debts he had accumulated through years of underhanded dealing. Phineas, with careful negotiation and the small fortune his cattle drives had earned that autumn, purchased a portion of the former Diamond Sea land at the auction, extending the Circle E's boundaries and securing Willow Creek's water rights permanently for his own ranch, ensuring that no future rancher would ever again threaten his family's livelihood over something so essential as water in that dry country. Florence moved into the ranch house as Phineas's wife, and though the adjustment to ranch life took some getting used to after years spent at her father's forge, she found herself content in ways she had never quite imagined possible. Phineas continued his lessons in sign language with unflagging dedication, and within a year of their marriage, he had grown fluent enough that they conversed easily across the dinner table each evening, his hands moving with a confidence that would have astonished the clumsy student who had first attempted the sign for tomorrow beneath lamplight in the bunkhouse. Ezra, unwilling to be far from his only daughter despite his contentment at seeing her so happily settled, eventually sold the smithy in town to a younger blacksmith who had apprenticed under him for years, and moved into a small cabin built on Circle E land, close enough to visit daily, but far enough to give the newlyweds their privacy. He took up light work shoeing the ranch's horses and mending tools, content in his retirement to watch his daughter's happiness unfold before him, and he taught Walter Briggs and several of the other hands basic signs as well, so that Florence never felt isolated among the men who worked her husband's ranch, but rather welcomed and included in the daily rhythms of Circle E life. Spring came, and with it, new life across the ranch in every sense. The cattle calved in healthy numbers, the grass grew tall and green along Willow Creek, and Florence discovered, to her own quiet joy and Phineas's overwhelming delight, that she was carrying their first child. She told him the news on a warm April evening, writing the words on the same slate they had used during their first tentative conversations on the porch steps, a slate that Phineas had kept and treasured despite his growing fluency in sign language, as though it represented something sacred about the beginning of their love. He had read the words on the slate twice, as though needing to confirm he had understood correctly, and then he had lifted her clean off her feet with a whoop of joy so loud that Walter Briggs came running from the barn to see what catastrophe had befallen the ranch house, only to find his employer spinning his laughing wife in circles across the porch, both of them crying and laughing at once in the golden evening light. Their first child, a son they named Ezra after his grandfather, was born in December of 1879, exactly 1 year after his parents' wedding, a healthy, loud-lunged boy with his father's sandy hair and his mother's dark, searching eyes. Florence had worried, quietly and privately before the birth, that her deafness might prevent her from being the mother her child deserved, that she would not hear his cries in the night or his first words when they came. But Phineas had held her hand through those fears the same way he held it through everything else, promising that they would face whatever challenges came together, that her love for their child would find whatever paths it needed to reach him, deafness or no deafness. And so it proved. Florence learned to feel the vibration of her son's cries through the floorboards of the nursery, learned to watch his small face for the first signs of hunger or discomfort long before he ever made a sound. And by the time young Ezra was old enough to babble his first words, Florence taught him signs alongside spoken language, so that from his very earliest days, the boy could communicate with his mother in the language of her heart as easily as he spoke aloud with his father and grandfather, and the ranch hands who doted on him. 2 more children followed in the years that came after, a daughter named Grace born in 1882, sharing her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn determination, and a second son, William, born in 1885, quiet and thoughtful in a way that reminded Florence powerfully of her own father in his younger years. All 3 children grew up fluent in sign language alongside spoken English, moving effortlessly between their mother's silent world and their father's world of sound, and the Circle E Ranch house rang, quite literally in the case of the hearing family members, with laughter and conversation in both languages simultaneously, a household unlike any other in the entire Wyoming Territory. Ezra Leland lived to see all 3 of his grandchildren grow past their earliest years, a constant presence at the ranch, teaching young Ezra the blacksmith's trade in the small forge Phineas had built specifically for his father-in-law's continued work, and signing stories to Grace and William about the early days of the territory, about Florence's mother whom none of them had ever known, about the long journey that had brought their family from Missouri to this particular patch of Wyoming grassland, where love had found them all in such unexpected fashion. He passed peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1891, having lived to see his daughter's deafness become not a burden the world imposed upon her, but rather a strength that had saved a good man's life, and built a family that celebrated silence and sound in equal, beautiful measure. Phineas Ellsworth never forgot, not for a single day of his long and happy marriage, that his life had been saved by a woman most of the territory had underestimated simply because she could not hear their words. He told the story often to his children and later to his grandchildren, of how Florence Leland had watched murder form on cruel men's lips and had ridden through the gathering dusk to warn a stranger who would become her husband, of how her silence had proven sharper and more perceptive than any hearing ear in the entire Wyoming Territory. And every time he told the story, he would look at his wife across whatever room they happened to be sitting in, and he would sign, simply and completely, the same 3 words that had become their private language of devotion over the decades of their marriage together. I see you. And Florence, who had spent her whole childhood fearing that no one ever truly would sign the words back to him, her eyes bright with a joy that had never once faded across all the years of their shared life together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and the wide, windswept grasslands of the ranch they had built and defended together. A home carved out of danger and transformed, through patience and love, and the remarkable gift of a young woman's watchful silence, into something that could only be called, in the end, a life beautifully and completely whole.